We're gonna be reading Salems a lot. I'm on chapter 2, page fucking 61. Susan's perspective, number 1. Scripture 7, I guess. I don't know what these little things are called. But let's do this. The drinks were gone and midnight passed. The moon was nearly out of sight. They had made some light conversation, and then she said into a pause, "I like you, Ben, very much." "I like you too, and I'm surprised." "No, I don't mean it that way. Do you remember that stupid crack I made in the park? This all seems too... fortuitous. I want to see you again, if you want to see me." "I do. But go slow. Remember, I'm just a small town girl." He smiled. It seemed so Hollywood. But Hollywood good. "Am I supposed to kiss you now?" "Yes," she said seriously. "I think that comes next." He was sitting in the rocker next to her, and without stopping its slow movement forth and back, he leaned over and pressed his mouth on hers, with no attempt to draw her tongue or to touch her. His lips were firm, with the pressure of his square teeth, and there was a faint taste odor of rum and tobacco. She began to rock also, and the movement made the kiss into something new. It waxed and waned, light and then firm. She thought, "He's tasting me." The thought wakened a secret, clean excitement in her, and she broke the kiss before it could take her further. "Wow," he said. "Would you like to come to dinner at my house tomorrow night?" she asked. "My folks would love to meet you, I bet." In the pleasure and serenity of this moment, she could throw that sop to her mother. Home cooking? The homiest. I'd love it. I'd been living on TV dinners since I moved in. 6 o'clock? We early in Sticksville. Sure. Fine. And speaking of home, I better get you there. Come on. They didn't speak on the ride back until she could see the night twinkling on the top of the hill, the one her mother always left out on when she was out. "I wonder who's up there tonight," she asked, looking toward the Marston house. "The new owner, probably," he said noncommittally. "It didn't look like electricity, that light," she mused. "Too yellow, too faint, kerosene lamp maybe. They probably haven't had a chance to have the power turned on yet." "Maybe, but almost anyone with a little foresight would call up the power company before they moved in." He didn't reply. They had come to her driveway. "Ben," she said suddenly, "is your new book about the Marston house?" He laughed and kissed the tip of her nose. "It's late." She smiled at him. "I don't mean to snoop. It's all right, but maybe another time, in daylight." "Okay, you better get in, girlie. 6 tomorrow?" She looked at her watch. 6 today? "Night, Susan. Night." She got out and ran lightly up the path to the side door, then turned and waved as he drove away. Before she went in, she added sour cream to the milkman's order, with baked potatoes that would add a little class to supper. She paused a minute longer before going in, looking up at the Marston house. Number 8. In his small box-like room, he understood with the light off and crawled into bed naked, undressed. She was a nice girl, the first nice one since Miranda had died. He hoped he wasn't trying to turn her into a new Miranda. That would be painful for him and horribly unfair to her. He lay down and let himself drift. Shortly before sleep took him, he hooked himself up on one elbow, looked past the square shadow of his typewriter and the sheaf of manuscript beside it, and out the window. He had asked Eva Milder specifically for this room after looking at several, because it faced the Marston house directly. The lights up there were still on. That night, he had the old dream for the first time. since he had come to Jerusalem's lot, and it had not come with such vividness since those terrible maroon days following Miranda's death in the motorcycle accident. The run up the hallway, the horrible scream of the door as he pulled it open, the dangling figure suddenly opening its hideous puffed eyes, himself turning to the door in the slow, sludgy panic of dreams, and finding it locked. Chapter 3. The Lot. Number 1. Maybe the gang? Number 1. The town is not slow to wake, chores won't wait, even while the edge of the sun lies below the horizon and darkness is on the land. Activity has begun. Number 2. 4 a.m. The Griffin boys. Hal, 18, and Jack, 14, and the 2 hired hands had begun the milking. The barn was a marvel of cleanliness, whitewashed and gleaming. Down the center, between the spotless runways, which fronted the stalls on both sides, a cement drinking trough ran. Hal turned on the water at the far end by flickering a switch and opening a valve. The electric pump that pulled water up from one of the 2 artesian wells that served up the place hummed into smooth operation. He was a Solomon boy, not bright, and especially irked on this day. He and his father had it out on the night before. Hal went to quit school. He hated school. He hated its boredom, its insistence that you sit still for great 50-minute chunks of time, and he hated all his subjects with the exceptions of woodshop and graphic arts. English was maddening. History was stupid. Business math was incomprehensible. And none of it mattered, and what was the hell of it? Cows didn't care if you said ain't or mixed your tenses. They didn't care who was the commander-in-chief of the goddamn army of the Potomac during the goddamn Civil War. And as for math, his own for Christ's sakes father couldn't add 2 fifths and 1/2 if it meant the firing squad. That's why he had an accountant. And look at that guy, college educated and still working for a dummy like his old man. His father had told him many times that book learning wasn't the secret of running a successful business, and dairy farming was a business like any other. Knowing people was the secret of that. His father was a great one to sling all that bullshit about the wonders of education. Him and his 6th grade education. He never read anything but Reader's Digest, and the farm was making $16,000 a year. No people be able to shake their hands and ask after their wives by name. Well, Hal knew people. There were 2 kinds, those you could push around and those you couldn't. The former outnumbered the latter 10 to 1. Unfortunately, his father was a 1. He looked over his shoulder at Jack, who was forking hay slowly and dreamily into the first 4 stalls from a broken bale. There was the bookworm, Daddy's pet, the miserable little shit. "Come on," he shouted. "Fork that hay." He opened the storage lockers and pulled out the first of their 4 milking machines. He trundled it down the aisle, frowning fiercely over the glittering stainless steel top. School. Fucking for Christ's sake, school. The next 9 months stretched ahead of him like an endless tomb. Interesting. And that's at 4 a.m. Number 3, 4:30 a.m. The fruits of yesterday's late milk killing have been processed and were now on their way back to the lot, this time in cartons rather than galvanized steel milk cans, under the colorful label of Slewfoot Hill Dairy. Charles Griffin's father had marketed his own milk, but that was no longer practical. The conglomerates had eaten up the last of the independents. How old are these guys? 18 or 14. Yeah. The Hill milkman in West Salem was Irwin Purrington, and he began his run along Brock Street, which was known in the country as the Brock Road or that Chrysalis washboard. Later, he would cover the center of town and then work back out of town along the Brooks Road. Wynn had turned 61 in August, and for the first time, his coming retirement seemed real and possible. His wife, a hateful old bitch named Elsie, had died in the fall of 1973. Predecessing him was the one considerate thing she had done in 27 years of marriage. And when his retirement finally came, he was going to pack up his dog, a half-cocker mongrel named Doc, and move down to Pemaquid Point. He planned to sleep until 9 o'clock every day and never look at another sunrise. He pulled over in front of the Norton house and filled his carry rack with their order: orange juice, 2 quarts of milk, a dozen eggs. Climbing out of the cab, his knee gave a twinge, but only a faint one. It was going to be a fine day. There was an addition to Miss Norton's usual order and Susan's order. Round. Palmer met the script. Please leave 1 small sour cream. Win, thanks. Purrington went back for it, thinking it was going to be one of those days when everyone wanted something special. Sour cream. He had tasted it once and liked to puke. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, and on the fields between here and town, heavy dew sparkled like a king's ransom of diamonds. That's weird. Most of the story, they were talking. The author talks about Salem's Lot, as if it's like something dreary and depressing and sad, and, creepy and scary. And this is the first time the author described it as something good, like a ransom of diamonds. A ransom. So maybe it's foreshadowing the king. The evil king is about to enter. The main antagonist of the story could enter now. It could also mean Salem's Lot has secrets, because a king's ransom of diamonds means you stole from the king. So maybe Salem's Lot is a land that's built on wealth, or some kind of wealth that's not originally theirs. Let's continue. 5:15 a.m. Eva Miller had been up for 20 minutes, dressed in a rag of a house dress and a pair of floppy pink slippers. She was cooking her breakfast: 4 scrambled eggs, 8 rashers of bacon, a skillet of home fries. She would garnish this humble repast with 2 slices of toast and jam, a 10-ounce tumbler of orange juice, and 2 cups of coffee with cream to follow. She was a big woman, but not precisely fat. She worked too hard at keeping her place up to ever be fat. The curves of her body were heroic. Rebelleza. Watching her in motion at her 8-burner electric stove was like watching the restless movements of the tide, or the migration of sand dunes. That's rude as hell. She liked to eat her morning meal, but she's not fat. She just ripples like the ocean. She liked to eat her morning meal in the utter solitude, planning the work ahead of her for the day. There was a lot of it. Wednesday was the day she changed the linen. She had 9 boarders at present, counting the new one, Miss Mears. The house had 3 stories and 17 rooms, and there were also floors to wash, the stairs to be scrubbed, the banister to be waxed, and the rug to be turned in the central common room. She would get Weasel Craig to help her with some of it. unless he was sleeping off a bed drunk. The back door opened just as she was sitting down at the table. Hi, Win. How are you doing? Passable. Knees kicking a bit. Sorry to hear it. You want to leave an extra quart of milk and a gallon of that lemonade? Sure, he said, resigned. I knew it was going to be that kind of day. She dug into her eggs, dismissing the comment. Win Purrington could always find something to complain about, although God knew he should have been the happiest man alive since that hellcat he had hooked up with fell down the cellar stairs and broke her neck. Oh, the hellcat broke her neck down the stairs? Sure, bro. I believe that. At 6:15, just as she was finishing up her second cup of coffee and smoking a Chesterfield, the press herald thumped against the side of the house and dropped into the rose bushes. The third time this week, the Kilby kid was batting 1,000, probably delivering the papers right out of his mind. Well, let it sit there a while. The earliest sunshine, thin and precious gold, was slanting in through the east windows. It was the best time of her day, and she would not disturb its moveless peace for anything. Her boarders had the use of the stove and the refrigerator that, like the weekly change of linen, came with their rent, and shortly after the peace would be broken as Grover Verrill and Mickey Sylvester came down to slop up their cereal before leaving for the textile mill over in Gates Falls where they both worked. As if her thought had summoned a messenger of their coming, the toilet on the second floor flushed, and she heard Sylvester's heavy work boots on the stairs. She heaved herself up and went to rescue the paper. "6:05 a.m. The baby's thin walls pierced Sandy McDowell's thin morning sleep, and she got up to check her baby with her eyes still blared shut. She barked her shin on the nightstand and said, "Kaka! Kaka!" The baby, hearing her, screamed louder. "Shut up," she yelled. "I'm coming." She walked down the narrow trailer corridor to the kitchen, a slender girl who was losing whatever marginal prettiness she might once have had. She got Randy's bottle out of the refrigerator, thought about warming it, then thought to hell with it. "If you want it so bad, Buster, you can just drink it cold." She went down to his bedroom and looked at him coldly. He was 10 months old, but sickly. And where was I? And pulling for his age, he had only started crawling last month. Maybe he had polio or something. Now there was something on his hands and on the wall too. She pushed forward, wondering what in Mary's name he had been into. She was 17 years old, and she and her husband had celebrated their first wedding anniversary in July. At the time, she had married Royce McDowell, 6 months pregnant and looking like the Goodyear blimp. Marriage had seemed every bit as blessed as Father Callahan said it was. A blessed escape hatch. Now it just seemed like a pile of caca, which was, she she saw with dismay, exactly what Randy had smeared all over his hands, on the well and in his hair. She stood looking at him dully, holding the cold bottle in one hand. This was what she had given up high school for her friends her hopes of becoming a model for this crummy trailer stuck out in the bend, Formica already peeling off the counters in strips, for a husband that worked all day at the mill and went off drinking or playing poker with his no-good gas station buddies at night, for a kid who looked just like his no-good old man and smeared caca all over everything. He was screaming at the top of his lungs. "You shut up!" she screamed back suddenly and threw the plastic bottle at him. It struck his forehead and he toppled on his back in the crib. wailing and thrashing his arms. There was a red circle just below the hairline, and she felt a horrid surge of gratification, pity, and hate in her throat. She plucked him out of the crib like a rag. Shut up! Shut up! Shut up! She had punched him twice before she could stop herself, and Randy's screams of pain had been too great for sound. He lay gasping in his crib, his face purple. I'm sorry, she muttered. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, I'm sorry. You okay, Randy? Just a minute. Mama's going to clean you up. By the time she came back with a wet rag, both of Randy's eyes had swelled shut and were discoloring. But he took the bottle when she began to wipe his face with a damp rag. He smiled toothlessly at her. I'll tell Roy he fell off the changing table, she thought. He'll believe that. Oh God, let him believe that. 6:45 a.m. I don't know how I felt about that. That's sad, you know. Um, yeah, that was intense. 6:45 a.m. Most of the blue-collar population in Salem's Lot was on its way back to work. Mike Ryerson was one of the few who worked in town. In the annual town report, he was listed as a groundskeeper, but he was actually in charge of maintaining the town's three cemeteries. In the summer, this was almost a full-time job, but even in the winter, it was no walk, as some folks, such as that prissy George Midler down at the hardware store, seemed to think. He worked part-time for Carl Foreman, the lot's undertaker, and most of the old folks seemed to poop off in the winter. Now he was on his way out to the Burns Road in his pickup truck, which was loaded down with clippers, a battery-driven hedge trimmer, a box of flag stands, a crowbar for lifting gravestones that might have fallen over, a 10-gallon gas can, and two Briggs and Stratton lawnmowers. He would mow the grass at Harmony Hill this morning and do any maintenance on the stones and the rock wall that was necessary. And this afternoon he would cross town to the Schoolyard Hill Cemetery, where school teachers sometimes came to do rubbings on account of an extinct colony of Shakers who had once buried their dead there. But he liked Harmony Hill best of all three. It was not as old as the Schoolyard Hill boneyard, but it was pleasant and shady. He hoped that someday he could be buried there himself, in 100 years or so. Who's he? Mike. He was 27 and had gone through 3 years of college in the course of a rather checkered career. He hoped to go back someday and finish up. He was good looking in an open, pleasant way, and he had no trouble connecting with unattached females on Saturday nights out at Dell's or in Portland. Some of them were turned off by his job, and Mike found this honestly hard to understand. It was pleasant work. There was no boss always looking over your shoulder, and the work was in the open air, under God's sky. And so what if he dug a few graves on an occasion, drove Carl Foreman's funeral hack? Somebody had to do it. To his way of thinking, the only thing more natural than death was sex. Humming. He turned off onto the Burns Road and shifted to second going up the hill. Dry dust fumed out behind him. Though the choked summer greenery on both sides of the road, he could see the skeletal, leafless trunks of the trees that had burned in the big fire of '51, like old and moldering bones. There were deadfalls back in there. He knew where a man could break his leg if he wasn't careful. Even after 25 years, the scar of the great burning was there. Well, that was just it. In the midst of life, we are in death. The cemetery was at the crest of the hill, and Mike turned in the drive, ready to get out and unlock the gate, and then brake the truck to the shuddering stop. The body of a dog hung. The body of a dog hung head down from the wrought iron gate, and the ground beneath was muddy with his blood. Mike got out of the truck and hurried over to it. He pulled his work gloves out of his back pockets and lifted the dog's head with one hand. It came up with horrible boneless ease, and he was staring into the blank glazed eyes of Win Pernington's mongrel Crocker. Doc. The dog had been hung on one of the gate's high spikes like a slab of beef on a meat hook. Flies, slow with the coolness of early morning, were already crawling sluggishly over his body. Mike struggled and yanked and finally pulled it off, feeling sick to his stomach at the wet sounds that accompanied his efforts. Ugh, that's disgusting, King. Graveyard vandalism was an old story to him, especially around Halloween, but that was still a month and a half away after he had seen anything like this. Usually they contented themselves with knocking over a few gravestones, sprawling a few obscenities, or hanging a paper skeleton from the gate. But if this slaughter was the work of kids, then they were real bastards. Wynn was going to be heartbroken. He debated taking the dog directly back to town and showing it to Parkins Gillespie, and decided it wouldn't gain anything. He could take poor old Doc back to town when he went in to eat his lunch. Not that he was going to have much appetite today. He unlocked the gate and looked at his gloves, which were smeared with blood. The iron bars of the gate would have to be scrubbed, and it looked like he wouldn't be getting over to Schoolyard Hill this afternoon. After all, he drove inside and parked, no longer humming. The zest had gone out of the day. What's his job? He's a groundskeeper. Alright, interesting. "8 a.m. The lumbering yellow school buses were making their appointed rounds, picking up the children who stood out by their mailboxes, holding their lunch buckets and skylarking. Charlie Rhodes was driving one of these buses, and his pickup route covered the Taggart Stream Road in East Salem and the upper half of Jointer Avenue. The kids who rode Charlie's bus were the best behaved in town, and the entire school district for that matter. There was no yelling or horseplay or pulling pigtails on bus 6. They goddamn well sat well still and minded their manners, or they could walk the 2 miles to Stanley Street Elementary and explain why in the office he knew what they thought of him, and he had a good idea of what they called him behind his back. But that was all right. He was not going to have a lot of foolishness and shit slinging on his bus. Let them save that for their spineless teachers. The principal at Stanley Street had the nerve to ask him if he hadn't acted impulsively when he put the Durbin boy off 3 days. When he put the Durham boy off 3 days running for 3 days running for just talking a little too loud. Charlie had just stared at him, and eventually the principal, a wet-eared little pipsqueak who had only been out of college for 4 years, had looked away. The man in charge of the SAD 21 motor pool, Dave Felsen, was an old buddy. They went all the way back to Korea together. They understood each other. They understood what was going on in the country. They understood how the kid who had been just talking a little too loud on the school bus in 58 was the kid who had been out pissing on the flag in 68. He glanced into the wide overhead mirror and saw Mary Kay Grigson passing a note to her little chum Brent Tenney. Little chum, yeah right. They were banging each other by the 6th grade these days. He pulled over, switching on his shop flashers. Mary Kay and Brent looked up dismayed. Got a lot to talk about? He asked into the mirror. Good. You better get started. He threw open the folding doors and waited for them to get the hell off his bus. I'm gonna take a pause, but we're gonna be reading 9 a.m. next. We're in page 77 of Salem's Lot. A penny's worth debt. This is the first night I've ever read it. So, at least I know the page. 77, right? I think it's still only chapter 2. So, that's crazy. Still only chapter 2. So, that's crazy. I got a like. Who likes my video? Is that me? I don't know. 9 a.m. Weasel Craig rolled out of bed literally. The sun shining in his second floor window was blinding. His head thumped queasily. Upstairs, that writer fellow was already pecking away. Christ, a man would have to be nuttier than a squirrel to tap 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 away like that, day in and day out. He got up and went over to the calendar in his unemployment. No, this was Wednesday. His hangover wasn't as bad as it had been on occasion. He had been out at Dell's until they closed at 1. He had only had $2 and hadn't been able to cage many beaters after that was gone. Losing my touch, he thought, and scrubbed the side of his face with one hand. He pulled on the thermal undershirt that he wore winter and summer, pulled on his green work pants, and then opened his closet and got breakfast. A bottle of warm beer for up here and a box of government donated commodities, oatmeal for downstairs. He hated oatmeal, but he had promised the widow he would help her turn that rug, and she would probably have some other chores lined up. He didn't mind, not really, but it was a come down from the days when he had shared Eva Miller's bed. Her husband had died in the sawmill in 59, and it was kind of funny in a way, if you could call any such horrible accidents funny. In those days, the sawmill had employed 60 or 70 men, and Ralph Miller had been in Ralph for the mill's presidency. What had happened to him was sort of funny because Ralph Miller hadn't touched a bit of machinery since '52, 7 years before when he stepped up from foreman to the front office. That was executive gratitude for you, sure enough, and Weasel supposed that Ralph had earned it. When the big fire had swept out of the marshes and jumped Jointer Avenue under the urging of a 25-mile-an-hour east wind, it had seemed that the sawmill was certain to go. The fire department ouch. Fire department. Neighboring townships had enough on their hands, trying to save the town without sparing men for such pissant operation as the Jerusalem's Lot sawmill. Ralph Miller had organized the whole second shift into a firefighting force, and under his direction they wetted the roof and did what the entire combined firefighting force had been unable to do west of Jointer Avenue. He had constructed a fire break that stopped the fire and turned it south, where it was fully contained. 7 years later, he had fallen into a shredding machine while he was talking to some visiting brass from a Massachusetts company. He had been taking them around the plant, hoping to convince them to buy in. His foot slipped in a puddle of water, and son of a bitch, right into the shredder before their very eyes. Needless to say, any possibility of a deal went right down the chute with Ralph Miller, the sawmill that he had saved in '51. Closed for good in February of '60. Weasel looked in his water-spotted mirror and combed his white hair, which was shaggy, beautiful, and still sexy at 67. It was the only part of him that seemed to thrive on alcohol. Then he pulled on his khaki work shirt, took his oatmeal box, and went downstairs. And here he was, almost 16 years after all of that had happened, hiring out as a frigging housekeeper to a woman he had one bedded, and a woman he still regarded as damned attractive. The widow fell on him like a vulture as soon as he stepped into the sunny kitchen. Say, Would you like to wax that from banister for me after you have your breakfast, Weasel? You got time? They both preserved a gentle fiction that he had these things as favors and not as pay for his $14 a week upstairs room. Sure would, Eva. And that rug in the front room has got to be turned. Yeah, I remember. How's your head this morning? She asked the question in a businesslike way, allowing no pity to enter her tone. But he sensed its existence beneath the surface. Head's fine, he said touchily, putting water on to boil for the oatmeal. You were out late, is why I asked. You got a line on me, is that right? He cocked the humorous eyebrow at her and was gratified to see that she could still blush like a schoolgirl, even though they had left off any funny stuff almost 9 years ago. Now, Ed, she was the only one who still called him that. To everyone else in the lot, he was just Weasel. Well, that was all right. Let them call him any odd old thing they wanted. The bear had caught him, sure enough. Never mind, he said gruffly. I got up on the wrong side of the bed. Fell out of it by the sound. She spoke more quickly than she had intended, but Weasel only grunted. He cooked and ate his hateful oatmeal, then took the can of furniture wax and rags without looking back. Upstairs, the tap-tap of that guy's typewriter went on and on. Vinny Upshaw, who had the room upstairs across from him, said he started in every morning at 9, went till noon. Started in again at 3, went until 6. Started in again at 9, and went right through until midnight. Weasel couldn't imagine having that many words in your mind. Still, he seemed a nice enough sort, and he might be good for a few beers out to Dell some night. He had heard most of those writers drank like fish. He began to polish the banister methodically and fell to thinking about the widow again. She had turned this place into a boarding house with her husband's insurance money, and she had done quite well. Why shouldn't she? She worked like a dray horse, but she must have been used to getting it regular from her husband, and after the grief had washed out of her, that need had remained. God, she had liked to do it. In those days, 61 and 62, people had still been calling him Ed instead of Weasel, and he had still been holding the bottle instead of the other way around. He had a good job on the B&M, and one night in January of 62 it had happened. He paused in the steady waxing movements and looked thoughtfully out of the narrow Judas window on the second floor landing. It was filled with the last bright, foolishly golden light of summer, a light that laughed at the cold, rattling autumn and the colder winter that would follow it. It had been part of her and part of him that night, and after it had happened, and they were lying together in the darkness of her bedroom, she begun to weep and tell him that what they had done was wrong. He told her it had been right, not knowing if it had been right or not, and not caring. And there had been Norther whooping and coughing and screaming around the eaves, and her room had been warm and safe, and at last they had slept together like spoons in a silverware drawer. Ah, God, and sunny Jesus. Time was like a river, and he wondered if that writer fella knew that. He began to polish the banister again with long, sweeping strokes. That's cool, because he's old, and he's just thinking about this guy. And he's like bothered by him because he's just typing, but really, he probably respects how hard he's working. We're just going to cut it there because I'm going to take a bite to eat, and after, I'll actually pick it up. We're at 10 a.m.